Op 11 september 2017 is het precies 16 jaar geleden dat er aanslagen gepleegd werden in de Amerikaanse stad New York, waarbij een gekaapt vliegtuig de Twin Towers van het World Trade Center invloog en een ander vliegtuig het Amerikaanse ministerie van Defensie, het Pentagon, raakte. De aanslagen waarbij als gevolg van de brand en het instorten van de 2 wolkenkrabbers in New York bijna 3000 doden afkomstig uit meer dan 90 landen zijn gevallen, hebben niet alleen in de Verenigde Staten een enorm effect gehad, maar in de hele wereld. Deze gebeurtenissen worden toegeschreven aan Osama bin Laden en zijn organisatie Al-Qaeda. Er zijn echter diverse theorieën over wat er zich op 11 september 2001 heeft afgespeeld. Er wordt door sommigen zelfs beweerd dat de Amerikaanse overheid onder leiding van toenmalig president George W. Bush de aanslagen zelf heeft georganiseerd om daarmee de zogenaamde oorlog tegen het terrorisme te rechtvaardigen. Andere aanhangers van complottheorieën geloven in een mildere vorm en wel dat de Amerikaanse overheid bewust heeft nagelaten de aanslagen te voorkomen. Kijkt u naar een analyse van de Amerikaanse architecten en ingenieurs over het instorten van de Twin Towers op 11 september.
This is the original site of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Construction is now underway where dramatic new facilities are being erected. Just 10 years ago, the planes hit the towers, cutting through some exterior and interior supporting structural steel columns. The fuel from the planes ignited office fires across several floors. According to the official reports, the structural steel frame was weakened and failed, causing a total progressive collapse of each tower. Does the official explanation make sense? Was there a comprehensive investigation that examined all of the evidence?
I walked into the office and the first words that I heard was, "A plane's just run into the World Trade Center." And my initial thought was, well, that's okay. It's built to withstand a 707.
It did not seem possible that these towers that were designed to withstand the impact of a 707 could possibly collapse in such a short order of time from the time that they were hit.
The majority of the jet fuel was burnt up instantly in the big fireball, and it was gone. The fires that were left were office furnishings and carpet and things like that. A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The media portrayed these fires as being extremely hot, but the fires were not that hot in World Trade Center 1 and 2. If you look at the NIST zone data, you could see this. And to use our own powers of observation, you could tell by seeing these fires and seeing black smoke come out the windows. That means that the fires were oxygen starved, and it was incomplete combustion. And so it was a low temperature fire.
I looked up in a manual the burning temperature of jet fuel and found that under the conditions that existed at the World Trade Center on 9/11, that jet fuel had to have been burning at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. I also noticed that the official explanation of what happened there was that the heat from the fire supposedly softened the steel and thereby brought the buildings down. If you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it. So immediately I knew at that point that the official explanation was dead wrong.
Rather than a slow groaning collapse that we might anticipate, the Twin Towers show in the videos a very rapid, sudden onset of destruction. What does this imply?
This claimed that the upper section of each of the towers crushed the lower section. However, when you watch video closely, in the case of World Trade Center 1, you'll see that the upper section disintegrates itself. It appears to be a controlled demolition of its own of the upper section.
The top section pushing on the bottom section, it's going to meet equal forces as it goes. Both sections are going to be demolished at the same rate. So by the time you've crushed up 15 stories below it, the top 15 stories are also going to be crushed. And so there's nothing left now to crush the rest of the building. You're looking for a jolt. That this thing, if it actually comes down and hits, you should be able to see the point at which they actually impact, because it would actually slow down the motion of the falling block.
Before the tower started collapsing from the top, the antenna started to fall. And the antenna, of course, was over the middle of the elevator shafts. I'm very familiar with the interior structure that surrounded the elevator shafts and the accessibility which the elevator companies had 24/7.
It wouldn't be a problem once you gained access to the elevator shafts. Then a team of loading experts would have access to all the core columns and beams. The rest could be accomplished at that point by just the right kind of explosives for the job at hand.
The only way that I can see that the towers could have collapsed is that the interior columns were compromised.
Over 100 first responders reported sounds of explosions and flashes of light at the onset of destruction of both towers. These were not discussed in the NIST report. What did these eyewitnesses actually see and hear?
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion
inside the lobby.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated. If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
And it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go like firecrackers.
They're reporting exactly what I would expect. You're hearing boom, 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 waves of explosions going off, not one massive big boom.
There's so many videos of witnesses from that day that report explosions. There's radio transmissions from the FDNY. We have the transcripts that were recorded, back in 2001 of all these firefighters and first responders reporting explosions.
This testimony should have caused the presumption that there was a good chance explosive residue would be found and justified testing for it, rather than the opposite.
It doesn't look like a collapse. It's like a huge mushrooming, billowing kind of an event. That whole thing looks nothing like a building falling down. It's a building being blown up. That's what the physics shows.
Yet they refuse to consider the possibility that explosives or some other form of demolition device could have been used to cause the collapses of the towers. And the fact that controlled demolition is consistent with all the available technical evidence. And the response to that request for correction is NIST simply saying they're unable to provide a full explanation for the total collapse, even though that was their task given to them by Congress.
FEMA documents a 1,200-foot diameter debris field around each tower. Videos show multi-ton steel sections of hundreds of individual steel pieces ejecting out of the towers at 60 miles an hour for a distance of 600 feet. They also show clouds of debris pulverized in mid-air and isolated explosive ejections as many as 60 stories below the so-called crush zone. Videos also show the near total destruction of both towers. What does all this tell us about the forces and energies involved in the destruction?
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
So something's happening to throw these things horizontally at those kinds of speeds. And here it is trailing white smoke the whole time. It really is indicative of some kind of explosion.
The individual explosions that I noticed 20 and 30 and 40 stories below the collapsing structure.
And naysayers tend to say, well, that's just air being blown out the windows. I mean, it doesn't really work to say it's just air pressure. And I've estimated these are coming out faster than 100 miles an hour.
The floors pancaking upon themselves would create gushes of air out the side, but not the kind of explosive force that we saw that would throw I-beams across the street into the windows of other buildings.
The ejection of the materials out of the building, the manner in which it fell, the speed at which it fell, exhibited all the signs of demolitions and the completeness of the destruction down to their individual elements.
As an architect, I would expect to see larger portions of the building floors, the decking, the steel decking, the concrete topping, much larger remnants of what the structural components of this building was.
What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized, and I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
In its report on World Trade Center 7, which came out in May of 2002, FEMA documents in Appendix C steel that has been melted and even partially evaporated, resembling Swiss cheese. What are we to make of this?
I'd like to know why NIST excluded the evidence of melting steel. Why is this not included? Why is this forensic evidence not being included in the report?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Many witnesses, firemen and lots of people described the flowing molten metal, iron or steel at extremely hot temperatures, and John Gross categorically denied their observations, so that because their observations don't fit his preconceived notion, he not only ignored evidence, he denied evidence. 'Cause 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 'c
There were reports of molten steel having been seen in the rubble pile of all three buildings, and I knew that jet fuel, which is essentially kerosene, is not capable of melting steel nor iron. Kerosene or jet fuel burns at less than 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, and molten steel needs at least 2700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron in the microspheres, in the rubble pile, and the metal pouring out of the side of the tower.
So what is this molten metal? It's a direct evidence for the use of thermite.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers.
I found a pore in the steel that had pure sulfur embedded in the pore, which I thought was very strange, and so that's when I really started looking for sulfur and finding it in more abundance in some of these phases.
There's a government theory that calcium sulfate from gypsum boards was the source of sulfur, and that's wrong. Calcium sulfate cannot undergo any kind of a chemical reaction that produces the element sulfur, and we're not dealing with any kind of compound of sulfur. When we're talking about sulfidation, we're dealing with the element sulfur.
There's a version of thermite called thermate, which has sulfur in the thermate, and what the sulfur does is it's sort of like salt on ice.
And it just basically makes the steel melt at a lower temperature. And if you do a search on Google for thermite and building demolition, you can find devices that have been fabricated and invented that use thermite for building demolitions.
In the case of thermite cutting charges, you would have heard far less noise, since they are worked by thermal heating, melting of the steel, rather than an explosive cutting as in RDX charges.
Overflights had detected with infrared camera 1400 degree Fahrenheit hotspots on the surface of ground zero, and that being there for a week indicates that there was something very hot going on below the surface.
So thermite would also explain potentially the fact that the fires could not be put out at ground zero. The fires lasted for quite a while, but most importantly, they were deep within the pile, where people would expect that the environment was oxygen starved. And thermite could explain this because it has its own oxidant within. It's actually the metallic oxide that provides the oxidant to allow the incendiary thermite reaction to occur, even underwater.
As much as 6% of the World Trade Center dust consisted of tiny, previously molten iron spheres. What does this tell us about the temperatures generated in the tower's destruction?
When the USGS collected samples of the World Trade Center dust, they found the iron microspheres. Insofar, the USGS does not have a valid explanation for the presence of these iron microspheres.
So what do the microspheres contain? Iron is the main element, and then it has smaller portions of aluminum, sulfur, a trace of manganese. Most of them are less than about 1/10 of an inch in diameter, and they're spherical. And they're found in all of the dust blown out of the buildings during collapse, no matter where in Manhattan that dust is picked up.
You must have had a much hotter heat source for you to get 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt the iron to get these molten spheres. Your heat source must be something like a chemical reaction, an exothermic chemical reaction that reacts, in the case of thermite, reacts at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit.
My contention, based on finding thermite residue in the dust, is that it happened before. It didn't happen after in the fires that ensued in the rubble pile afterwards. It's all the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved in melting those steel beams.
Nangawamping anomo bravo no kanya eju anu orele gismo nyame nanga pinga yusa ondro pemi futuru manasari futuru nangawanga nunomo boto no salo eju pari lona botogo